The air was colder than usual for early autumn, and a strange hush had settled over our village as evening fell. People lingered on the edges of the square, murmuring in low voices, eyes darting between each other and the distant path into town. It was the same every year. No one would say it out loud, but we all knew what was coming. He was coming. Just as he always did. Just as he always would. I stayed back, blending into the shadows of the bakery, the scent of cooling bread around me as I kept watch along with the others. There was something different about him compared to any traveler I'd ever seen. He wore a coat cut from fine wool, with cuffs stitched in silver thread that caught the last light of day as he made his way toward us. His clothing was unlike anything you'd see in our village, or even in the larger towns beyond. And while his face was friendly, even warm, I could sense an undercurrent, a pull just beneath the surface that made it hard to look away. He nodded at familiar faces, and though he barely glanced in my direction, I could have sworn he caught my eye for a split second. A chill went through me, and I wondered if he remembered my face from his previous visits. This stranger wasn't a man of particular age. He was somehow ageless, as if he'd stepped out of time itself. The fine lines around his eyes, his dark hair, his graceful, poised way of walking, it all felt timeless, but in a way that never seemed quite right. When he reached the center of the square, he paused and swept his gaze over us, that warm, unsettling smile still in place. The villagers barely moved, a mix of fear and curiosity holding them in place. He looked like he belonged here and yet didn't, like a single dark stroke on a serene landscape. He had the habit of appearing out of nowhere, always just as the leaves began to turn. And each year, after his departure, one of our own went missing. Yet he spoke with a voice as soothing as any I ever heard. He spun his words like a spell, promising fortunes, laughter, the relief of sorrows long held. The other villagers shifted, almost imperceptibly, inching closer, listening to the words that left his lips. His promises wove through the air like the smoke from a snuff candle, lingering, leaving a strange scent behind. He talked of adventure and riches, of lands unseen and rewards beyond measure. And in some dark, twisted way, I could almost see myself believing him. But it was his knowledge that frightened me the most. He seemed to know things no stranger could possibly know. Last year, I remember hearing him tell Clara, the baker's daughter, about the locket she kept hidden beneath the floorboard, the one she hadn't dared to wear since her mother had passed. And then there was old Tom who, one visit years ago, had dared to ask the traveler how he knew so much about us. The traveler had looked Tom square in the eye, a smile that seemed to know too much playing across his lips. "Because it's my job to know," he'd said simply. And no one had questioned him again. I watched as the villagers seemed to fall under his spell. Some of the older folks crossed themselves, whispering prayers, while others inched forward, as if his promises alone could lift them from their worn lives. A part of me ached with the same longing, and yet I resisted. I wasn't sure if it was fear or caution, but something held me back. Still, I found myself taking a step closer, caught between wariness and fascination. The way he looked at each of us, as if we were pieces on a chessboard, each important in our own way, each part of some hidden strategy that only he understood, sent a shiver up my spine. As I lingered at the edge of the crowd, memories of past years slipped back into my mind. I could recall, with unsettling clarity, each of his visits. Every year, he'd come strolling into town like a mist rolling off the lake, smooth and steady, and each time, one of our own would disappear soon after. It was never immediate, never blatant. No, the losses were subtle, almost quiet, like a candle quietly snuffed out in the night. Old Thaddeus from the mill had been the first I remembered. Folks had dismissed his disappearance as a tragic accident. They said he'd wandered too far from the village and met some unknown fate in the woods, likely lost or fallen into a ravine. But I'd seen his daughter's face when she'd learned her father was gone. There was no hope, no uncertainty, just an odd, hollow acceptance, as though she knew, deep down, that he'd never be found. The following year, it was Marta, a mother of 2 young boys, who vanished. She was last seen on the night the traveler had left town. Her family had clung to the idea that she'd run off to escape a loveless marriage, but it never made sense to me. Marta adored her boys. She would have never abandoned them without so much as a goodbye. Each loss was followed by whispers, hushed murmurs about how these disappearances seemed to happen only after his visit. Some chalked it up to coincidence, others to bad fortune, a natural curse on a village as remote as ours. But this year, something felt different. It wasn't just the chill in the air or the way the village felt even more subdued. No, this time, there were signs. Symbols, strange markings, had started to appear around the homes of the missing, scrawled on walls, scratched into wood, left like warnings or reminders. 3 days before the traveler's arrival, I noticed a twisting, jagged shape etched into the wood near Clara's bakery. She vanished the year before, and no one seemed to know how the mark got there. It was faint, nearly mist in the weathered wood, but when I looked closer, I felt a sickening dread. A part of me wanted to dismiss it, call it children's mischief or some strange trick of the eye, but then I began hearing stories from others. Old Tom, the same one who'd once questioned the traveler, had told me he'd heard whispers outside his window at night, faint and unsettling. He said they sounded like voices calling his name, whispering secrets he was too afraid to understand. And as he spoke, I could see the shadow of fear deep in his eyes. Tom had always been a practical man, not one given to flights of fancy. If he was unnerved, it meant something. Then, last night, I caught wind of something even stranger. Beatrice, the woman who ran the inn, had been welcoming the traveler with an unusual eagerness, a near desperation that I hadn't seen before. She murmured about fortunes, about finally getting what we deserve. Others seemed to agree, muttering about how the traveler might bring wealth, opportunity, anything to break the monotony of our lives. And yet, behind their eyes, I saw a flicker of something darker. Greed? Desperation? Or maybe just fear of what he might do if they turned him away. But I'd also overheard the mutterings of those who felt otherwise. Curses, they whispered. Dark, ancient curses bound to this place. They said he came here for more than just his annual visit, that he came to take something from us, to draw some twisted sustenance from the life here, leaving behind only ruin. They spoke of hidden truths, of mysteries buried deep within the history of our village, secrets that only the traveler understood. The thought gnawed at me, an uncomfortable itch I couldn't ignore. My mind spun with questions, and for a brief moment, I felt the urge to cry out, to warn my neighbors that we were being played, that whatever charm the traveler wore was a mask for something far darker. But who would listen? Who would believe a young fool like me? And so I stayed silent, torn between my need for answers and the fear of what I might find if I sought them out on my own. Every instinct told me to stay away, to keep my head down and avoid his gaze as best I could. But I also felt a pull, an unexplainable urge to confront this shadow hanging over our village, to unravel the threads binding him to this place, to us. That night, as the moon rose high above, bathing the village in its cold, silvery glow, I found myself alone in my home, the quiet pressing in from all sides. I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were a tangled mess, and my gut twisted with a deep, uneasy feeling that something was coming. I just about convinced myself to go to bed when I heard it, a faint sound, like something dragging against stone. Heart pounding, I crept to my door, peering through a crack in the old wood. There, just outside my home, was another of those twisted symbols, larger this time, dug into the dirt with sharp, deliberate lines. It wasn't there earlier. Someone, something, had left it for me, and even in the dim light, I could see it was fresh, almost gleaming as if made from something other than dirt. A chill ran down my spine, and for a brief, paralyzing moment, I was certain I wasn't alone. The night was too quiet, too still. And as I stood there, staring at the twisted shape in the ground, I could almost feel eyes watching me, lingering just beyond the shadows. As the days passed, I found myself drawn deeper into the mystery surrounding the traveler. I tried to keep a low profile, feigning indifference, but inside I felt a growing need to understand who, or what, this man truly was. The strange marking outside my home had ignited something in me, a dark curiosity that, despite my better judgment, I couldn't shake. I started by speaking to the elders, those who had been around long enough to remember the village before the travelers' visits became a regular, yearly event. I found old Miriam first, a hunched woman with a gaze sharp as steel despite her age. She looked at me closely as I sat across from her in her dimly lit kitchen, her wrinkled hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "He's been coming for longer than you might think," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I remember when I was a little girl, he wasn't so regular then. He'd appear every few years, maybe, and only in the dead of winter. The air would turn bitter cold, and strange sounds would echo through the woods. People said he'd come to take what was rightfully his. They said he was bound to something dark. Older than the village itself, older than anything that walks in daylight." "Bound?" I repeated, goosebumps pricking along my arms. She nodded, her eyes gleaming with something like fear. "Bound to a force none of us can understand. He doesn't come here just to take people, you see. He's a collector of sorts. He gathers souls, one at a time, for something else. We never knew what, but we knew enough to keep our distance." Her words hung heavily in the air. There was an eerie certainty in her tone, as if she'd been waiting a lifetime for someone to ask her these questions, yet regretted speaking them aloud. I continued to seek out others, hearing versions of the same story, whispered tales of dark rituals, of hidden places in the forest where twisted trees and strange stones marked spots of old magic. One elder, Tom's Aunt Maisie, insisted the travelers' visits were part of an ancient bargain, a pact made to protect the village from forces darker than even him. Another warned me with trembling hands that curiosity had a steep price in our village. "Anyone who digs too deeply," he said, his voice low and trembling, "vanishes by morning." Despite these warnings, I couldn't stop myself. The puzzle pieces were beginning to form a disturbing picture, but there were still too many gaps, too many unanswered questions. I knew that whatever truth lay at the heart of this, it would require a risk far greater than simply speaking with the village elders. It would mean following him, watching him when he thought he was alone. I decided to act on the following night. Just before sundown, I took a position at the far edge of the village, waiting in the shadows near the old sycamore where he often wandered at dusk. As darkness crept over the village, I heard footsteps, the faint, measured steps of someone moving deliberately, each sound precise, almost rhythmic. My pulse quickened as I saw him. The traveler emerged from his usual spot in the square, his tall figure cast in shadow beneath the moonlight. He moved with a grace that seemed at odds with his surroundings, his head held high, as though the village were merely a passing scene on his journey to somewhere far beyond. I stayed low, keeping a safe distance as he made his way toward the woods on the village's edge, where none of us ever dared to go after nightfall. He stopped at the edge of the trees, looking back as though sensing he were being watched. I ducked behind a nearby tree, barely daring to breathe. When I looked up again, he had vanished into the shadows. Swallowing my fear, I followed him, the silence of the woods around me broken only by the crackle of fallen leaves beneath my feet. After a short walk, we came upon a small clearing, illuminated by an otherworldly light. He was already there, standing before a stone altar, rough and ancient, its surface worn from centuries of rain and weather. Strange carvings ran along its edges, symbols that matched the markings I'd seen outside my home, twisted and angular, almost moving in the flickering light. My stomach tightened as I realized he was whispering, a soft, melodic chant in a language that sent chills down my spine. He raised his hands, and from the folds of his coat, he produced something, a small, glimmering object that seemed to pulse with a dim light of its own. I squinted, trying to make it out. A pendant? A locket? I couldn't be sure, but as he lifted it, the air around him grew cold, colder than I thought possible. My breath fogged in front of me, and it felt as though a layer of frost was settling on my skin. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond, a faint sound emerged. It was soft at first, like a distant murmur, but it grew steadily, a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from all directions at once. The voices were unintelligible, a blend of words I couldn't understand, but they carried a weight, a sorrow, a yearning that was almost palpable. I clutched the tree beside me, feeling as though the ground itself was shifting beneath my feet. Suddenly, he stopped chanting, and the voices fell silent. He lowered his arms, and in that quiet moment, I could have sworn I saw something move behind him, a shadow, tall and thin, stretching impossibly far, cast by no light that I could see. It loomed over him, its shape shifting as though it were alive. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The traveler stepped back from the altar, and I watched as he carefully placed the glimmering object onto the stone. The whispers began anew, faint and mournful, and the object seemed to sink into the altar, as though swallowed by the very stone itself. He turned, and I felt a wave of panic as his gaze swept over the trees, his eyes narrowing. I ducked down, pressing myself against the rough bark, my heart racing. For a moment, I was certain he'd seen me. But then, without a word, he turned and began walking back toward the village, his steps as steady and graceful as they had been before. I stayed hidden until I could no longer hear his footsteps, then rose, my legs shaky, my mind spinning with questions and fears I could barely comprehend. I made my way back home, my thoughts racing. There was something about that ritual, something dark and binding. I could still feel the chill of the whispers echoing in my ears, as if they clung to me, marking me as part of whatever dark pact had been sealed in that clearing. Back in the safety of my home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been drawn into something far beyond my understanding. As I lay in bed, I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see him standing outside, watching me with that knowing, unsettling smile. Sleep was out of the question. All I could do was lie there, the strange symbols, the whispers, the shadowy figure from the clearing replaying in my mind. And when dawn finally came, I felt no relief, only a deepening sense of dread. I knew that I ventured too close to a secret meant to be left alone. As the days wore on, I felt myself sinking deeper into the murky history of the village. Each new discovery seemed to unlock something darker than the last, and the sense of dread that had started as a whisper now clung to me like a shadow. I'd been combing through every scrap of information I could find, speaking in hushed tones with anyone who might know the village's secrets. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon an old chest in the attic of the village chapel that the true depth of our village's curse began to unravel. The chest was covered in dust, tucked behind crumbling boxes of moth-eaten animals. At first, It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but as I brushed off the dirt, I noticed strange engravings along its edges, symbols eerily similar to the ones I'd seen on the stone altar in the woods. My hand shook as I lifted the lid, half expecting to be met by something that might curse me just for looking at it. Inside were stacks of yellowed letters, bound together with frayed ribbons. They were brittle to the touch, each one written in an elegant, flowing script that seemed to belong to another era. With a deep breath, I picked up the top letter and began to read. October 7th, 1792. To the descendants and keepers of this bargain. By now, you have seen the fruits of the pact, the bounty that blesses our soil, and the protection that keeps our children from harm. Know this, the price is fair, and the debt must be honored. Each year, one of us must go, chosen by the fate that binds us to our guardian. In exchange, the village will prosper. The traveler will arrive as he always has, and he must be welcomed. Our prosperity depends upon it. I felt the blood drain from my face. The words "one of us must go" hung in my mind like a dark cloud. I flipped to the next letter, each one telling a similar story, an unbroken chain of promises and warnings passed down from generation to generation. The letters spoke of a ritualistic offering, a guardian who would watch over the village as long as the pact was upheld. They described how the traveler was no ordinary man, but rather a servant of something far more ancient and powerful, bound to us by this deal. The next letter was even more explicit, its words piercing me with a sickening clarity. November 2nd, 1847. To those who inherit the knowledge. We offer what we must, for the good of all. The chosen will vanish without a trace, for that is the way of the guardian. It is he who takes them, he who decides. Never look back. It is our silence that protects us. Those who question will suffer a fate far darker than disappearance. I could hardly breathe. For years, I've lived among these people, and not once had I questioned the strange fortune of our crops, the way our village remained untouched by storms and illness while the world around us faltered. But now I understood. Our so-called blessings came with a terrible cost, and I was part of a village built on blood. Just as I finished reading, I heard a creak behind me. My heart leapt, and I whipped around, clutching the letters to my chest. Standing in the doorway was one of my neighbors, Peter, a quiet man who rarely spoke, always keeping to himself. His eyes were cold and unblinking as he took in the sight of me clutching the ancient letters, piecing together the forbidden knowledge I wasn't meant to know. "You've gone too far," he said, his voice low and even. "There are things you're better off not understanding. People have disappeared for less than what you've just uncovered." My mouth went dry. "How long have you known?" I managed to whisper. Peter sighed, glancing at the letters with a look that was almost pitying. "Long enough to understand that there are rules to this place. Rules that keep us safe. We do what we must, and we do not speak of it." "You're telling me you're okay with this?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "With just letting people disappear? Every year?" Peter looked at me with a strange intensity, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "It's not about being okay with it. It's about survival. The pact was made long before we were born, by people who understood things that we never could. Without it, our village would fall to ruin. It's not our place to question." A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. It was as if the whole village had been swallowed by this pact, everyone moving in silent complicity to keep the peace, to keep themselves safe. And here I was, on the brink of unraveling their precious balance. "Listen to me carefully," Peter continued, stepping closer. "If you value your life, you will put those letters back where you found them and forget you ever saw them. The traveler is coming again soon, and you don't want to be the reason things go wrong this year." The threat was clear. He didn't need to say more. I was caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than I had anticipated, something woven so deeply into the fabric of this village that pulling at it could bring the whole thing crashing down. But even as Peter's words echoed in my mind, I knew I couldn't just turn away. The weight of this knowledge was too heavy, too horrifying. And there was a part of me that felt responsible to those who had disappeared, to those who might still be taken. That night, I lay in bed, my mind racing with what I'd learned. It was impossible to ignore the truth now, to pretend I could simply go on living as if nothing had changed. I had seen too much. And, worse, I knew that others in the village were not only aware of the pact, but complicit in it. I spent the next few days piecing together more clues, despite the wary glances I received from my neighbors. It became clear to me that there were others who helped the traveler each year, ensuring that a suitable offering was made. This wasn't just a passive acceptance of fate. Some villagers actively participated in the ritual, choosing who would vanish, guiding them unknowingly toward the traveler's grasp. The idea of it made my skin crawl. People I'd known all my life, people who'd shared smiles and meals and laughter with me, were part of a dark conspiracy to feed the traveler's demands. My fear turned to anger. I had to do something, anything to break this cycle, to save someone, anyone, from the same fate. And yet, I knew the risks. Peter's warning haunted me, the threat of vanishing hanging over me like a shadow. But my conscience was louder, refusing to let me sit idly by. As the day of the traveler's return approached, the village seemed to buzz with a strange energy. People's faces were tense, their eyes darting suspiciously at one another. I wasn't the only one who sensed the unspoken dread, the rising fear that this year might be different. On the final night, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, I heard a faint knock at my door. My heart raced as I opened it, half expecting to see Peter standing there with a final warning. Instead, I was met by the village's oldest resident, old Miriam, who had first hinted at the pact's existence. "You must not interfere," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He will come, and he will take what is owed. Do not think you can change what has been set in motion for centuries. Those who try, they never survive to tell of it." I stared at her, feeling a chill run down my spine. "But if we do nothing, he'll keep coming back. More people will vanish." She gave me a look filled with something akin to sorrow, yet there was a hint of steel in her eyes. "You don't understand, child. If we break the pact, we risk a fate far worse than vanishing. The Guardian's wrath would make this village a place of eternal suffering. And you would be the first to pay the price." With those words, she turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving me standing alone in the dim light, her warning echoing in my ears. The weight of her words settled heavily on me, and for the first time, I questioned whether my quest for truth was worth the cost. But as the night deepened, I knew that, pact or no pact, I could no longer stand by in silence. The night of the traveler's visit had arrived, casting a heavy silence over the village. The air was thick with fear, each house veiled in shadow, its occupants huddled inside, unwilling to bear witness to the ritual they all knew was coming. I could feel the tension crackling around me like static, pressing down on my skin as I made my way toward the heart of the village square where the traveler waited. He was already there, standing calmly under the dim glow of the street lamp, hands clasped behind his back. His suit was immaculate, somehow untouched by the dirt of the road. His gaze swept across the empty square, his posture both regal and predatory, as if he owned every stone beneath his feet. He was waiting, and the thought sent a shiver down my spine. As I approached, he turned his gaze toward me, eyes gleaming with that unsettling, all-knowing glint. It was as if he could see right through me, past my fear and into the depths of my mind where every dark thought, every secret, lay exposed. "Ah," he said softly, his voice a low, velvety whisper. "The curious one. I had a feeling you'd come to see me tonight." I stopped a few feet away, feeling my pulse hammering in my chest. "I know who you are," I managed, my voice steady despite the tremor in my limbs. "I know what you've been doing to this village, taking people year after year, feeding off their lives like some kind of parasite." His lips curled into a small smile. "Feeding off them?" he echoed, sounding almost amused. "My dear, I only take what has been offered. Your village entered this pact willingly, centuries ago. I am merely upholding tradition." "Tradition?" I spat, my anger rising. "Is that what you call murder? Every year, someone disappears, and you just walk away with no consequences. But not this time. This time, I'm here to stop you." The traveler's smile widened, showing a hint of perfect, white teeth. "Are you now?" he said, his voice a low purr. He took a step forward, and instinctively, I backed away. He laughed softly, as if my defiance was nothing more than an entertaining game to him. "Let me tell you something, my inquisitive friend," he continued, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "I know all about your little investigation. Every question you've asked, every letter you've read, every conversation you've had. Did you really think you could delve into matters that have bound this village for centuries and walk away unscathed?" I felt a chill run down my spine, but I held my ground. "If you think I'm afraid of you, you're wrong. The people in this village deserve to be free of your curse. They deserve to live without fearing who will vanish next." He chuckled, and the sound echoed through the empty square, sending a shiver down my spine. "Oh, they deserve it, do they?" he said mockingly. "Tell me, did anyone in this village ask for your intervention? Did anyone beg you to save them?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. He was right. In all my searching, in all my questioning, I had found only resistance and silence. The villagers had clung to their secrets, bound by fear, unwilling to defy the pact that kept their lives secure. He took another step toward me, his voice soft but laced with menace. "They know the price. They understand that prosperity comes at a cost. And you have upset the balance." He paused, and his smile twisted into something cruel. "Perhaps that's why, this year, the village has chosen someone truly exceptional as the offering." A chill washed over me, colder than any winter wind. "What are you talking about?" The traveler's smile widened, a glimmer of amusement in his dark eyes. "Oh, surely you understand by now. You spent so much time uncovering the secrets of the pact, questioning its very existence. The village may resist change, but even they understand that sometimes sacrifices must be made to preserve their way of life. And who better than someone who has already threatened to destroy it?" My heart plummeted as the truth sank in. They had chosen me. The villagers, the people I had grown up with, the ones I had trusted, had decided I was the one who should disappear this year. "No," I whispered, taking a step back. That can't be." "Can't it?" he asked, tilting his head in mock innocence. "You've seen it yourself, the letters, the symbols, the whispered warnings. Every villager has known this day would come, that someone would pay the price to keep the pact alive. They've simply decided it's you." I staggered backward, my mind racing as panic surged within me. I was the chosen one. I was the sacrifice. And now, standing before the traveler, I realized I was utterly alone. He took another step toward me, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "Are you ready, then, to fulfill your village's bargain?" "No," I shouted, spinning on my heel and bolting from the square, the weight of his laughter trailing after me like a dark cloud. I sprinted down the narrow streets, my heart pounding, terror clawing at my throat as I ran blindly into the darkened village. The shadows felt alive, twisting around me as I passed silent houses, the windows darkened, as if the villagers had all turned their backs on me, content to let me meet my fate. Panic clouded my thoughts, and every corner I turned seemed to lead to another dead end, another silent, accusing house. Behind me, I could hear the traveler's footsteps, steady and deliberate. He wasn't rushing, he didn't need to. He knew I had nowhere to go. "Please," I cried, banging on a door as I passed. "Someone help me. Please." The door remained closed. In the eerie silence, I thought I heard a shuffling inside, a murmur of voices, but no one came. No one answered. They had abandoned me to the fate they had chosen. I kept running, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way out, some place to hide. I needed to disappear, just as so many others had, but on my own terms. Finally, I found myself on the edge of the village, near the forest where I had first seen the traveler performing his strange ritual. I hesitated, my heart pounding as I looked into the darkness of the trees. It was dangerous, but it was my only option. With one last look over my shoulder, I plunged into the woods, the branches clawing at my clothes as I stumbled through the underbrush. The trees seemed to close in around me, the silence pressing in until I could hear nothing but the sound of my own labored breathing. But the traveler was still there. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him, his presence like a dark weight in the air, drawing closer with each passing second. I kept running, pushing deeper into the woods, my mind frantic as I searched for some place to hide, some way to escape. But every step seemed to lead me back to where I'd started, as if the forest itself were conspiring against me, trapping me in a maze with no way out. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I stumbled into a small clearing, the moon casting a pale light on a stone altar at its center. It was the same altar where I had seen the traveler before, the place where he had performed his ritual. I backed away, my heart pounding as the realization dawned on me. I had been led here, driven to the very place where the offering would be made. I turned to run, but there he was, standing at the edge of the clearing, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. His silence was more damning than any threat. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, and fell to the ground, my breath catching as I stared up at him in horror. "It's time," he murmured, his voice soft and final. "The pact must be honored." As he stepped closer, the world around me seemed to fade, the forest dissolving into darkness. I could feel his gaze piercing into me, stripping away every last defense, every last hope. And as he reached out, his hand closing over mine, I realized that the village had been right all along. Some sacrifices are inescapable. The night was drawing to a close, but the village seemed eerily still, as if holding its breath in the darkness. The traveler, his cold smile never wavering, stood before me, his hands clasped as though this moment, this ritual, had been an inevitable conclusion from the very start. My body trembled, but I was not going to give up. Not without a fight. I turned and bolted back toward the village, my heart pounding, knowing that I had one last chance, one last desperate attempt to rally the villagers to my side. If I could get to them, if I could get them to see what was happening, perhaps we could stop the cycle, maybe even stop the traveler himself. I had seen the fear in their eyes, heard their whispers of curses and bargains. There had to be something, someone, willing to stand against him. I ran through the streets, my feet slapping the cobblestones, the silence of the night pressing against my ears. The village was empty, though. Not a soul in sight. I knocked on doors, pleaded with the closed windows, but no one answered. My heart sank as I realized the truth. I was too late. It wasn't just me who had been fooled, it was all of us. Then, through the thick fog of panic, I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was the traveler, coming to claim me once more. But as I turned a corner, I saw them. The villagers. They were running from the traveler, they were walking toward him, slow and steady, as though they had been waiting for this moment all along. Their faces were serene, almost calm, like they had been lulled into a trance. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. "Stop! Don't you see what he's doing to us? He's been taking us one by one, and every year, someone else vanishes. We're sacrificing ourselves, our people, for his fortune. Don't you understand?" But they didn't stop. They simply looked at me with pity in their eyes, as if I were the one who had lost my mind. "Why?" I whispered, barely able to choke out the word. "Why are you doing this?" An elderly woman stepped forward, her face lined with years of hard living. She wasn't surprised by my outburst. No, she seemed resigned, almost as if this was all part of the plan. Her voice was soft, but there was a finality to it. "You don't understand, child," she said, her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. "We've made our choice. We've made peace with it." I shook my head, my mind reeling. Made peace? With what? The deaths of our own? "They're not deaths," another voice chimed in, this time from a man I had known since childhood. "They're offerings. Offerings to ensure the prosperity of our village. We've had riches, protection, and safety because of the pact. You think the traveler just takes from us? No. He gives in return. And we've all benefited." I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. It was worse than I had feared. The villagers, the people I had trusted and willingly accepted the gifts of fortune and power in exchange for the lives of others. They were complicit. No, they were participants in this twisted ritual. "No," I whispered, unable to comprehend it. "You're all a part of it? Every single one of you?" The elderly woman nodded solemnly. "We chose long ago to give what was required. And when you know the price of prosperity, it becomes easier to accept it. But we've lost so many." I cried. The disappearances. The whispers. "Don't you care?" She looked at me with the same pitying expression. "We've all lost someone, child. But in return, we've gained so much more. There's nothing left to fight for." My mind was spinning, my body shaking with a mix of disbelief and horror. They were all complicit. Every single one of them. I had been fighting alone, thinking I was the only one who saw through the illusion, but in truth, the illusion had been carefully crafted by the traveler, and they had all bought into it. I turned away from them, desperate, needing to escape. But it was too late. The traveler was there, standing at the edge of the crowd, his eyes glimmering with dark satisfaction. His smile was predatory, as though he had been anticipating this moment all along. "You see," he said, his voice low and smooth. "The true horror isn't the sacrifices, the disappearances. It's the way we make ourselves believe we have no choice. We're all bound by a curse, my dear. A curse that was never truly ours to begin with." I froze, my blood running cold as his words sank in. "What do you mean?" I whispered, almost afraid to hear the answer. He took a step toward me, his eyes glowing with something darker, something ancient. "You see, I am not the true villain in this tale. I am merely the messenger, the keeper of the bargain. My existence, my very soul, is bound by the pact I have inherited. I was cursed, long ago, by forces far greater than any of us, and now I must gather souls to sustain myself. To survive." I stared at him, the pieces falling into place in a way that made my stomach churn. "You're cursed?" He nodded slowly. "I was once like you, a mortal man, before I became what I am now. This village is not the only place I visit. There are many others, many towns and cities that have made similar bargains over the centuries. And I am the one who must ensure that the deal is upheld, that the price is paid." I stumbled back, the weight of his words crashing over me like a wave. But you could leave. You could let us go. You don't have to do this anymore." He smiled softly, the expression almost sad. "I wish it were that simple. But I am bound, just as you are. The curse has no end, no escape. And every year, I come to collect, just as I've always done." I looked around at the villagers, standing there with their empty eyes, and I felt a deep, bone-chilling realization. They, too, were bound by the same curse, the same ancient force that had brought the traveler here. They had accepted the pact, knowing full well what it meant. They were willing participants in this endless cycle of death. The sun was beginning to rise in the distance, the first rays of light creeping over the horizon, casting long shadows across the village. The truth had settled into my bones like ice, cold and unrelenting. In the end, there was no escape. I was as much a part of the pact as anyone else. I had tried to fight it, but the villagers had made their choice, and now it was my turn to pay the price. As the light of dawn began to break over the village, I realized that I, too, would disappear by morning. And there would be no one left to remember me.